Hello again. You are watching today on eNCA, DSTV channel 43 with me, Dan Moyana. Happy Africa Day. I'm donning my Africa Day socks. So we wish you a very good one. And coinciding with today, 25th of May being Africa Day, we're looking at brands now about how they are doing on the continent. Nike is said to be the most admired brand now in Africa. And MTN, the most admired African brand, but it has dropped out of the top 10. Brand Africa has just released its latest list of the most admired brands on the continent, which, as I've said today, is marking Africa Day. The list is based on a survey conducted across 32 African countries that account for more than 85% of the continent's GDP and population. Now, despite the progress in driving several African initiatives, African brands regressed from a 10-year high of 17% to a 14% share of the top 100 most admired brands on our continent. Well, to unpack the results and discuss this further, I'm joined by Thebe Ikalafeng, the founder and chairperson of Brand Africa. Thebe, happy Africa Day.
Happy
Welcome.
Africa Day,
Good
Dan.
afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I love the socks. I love the socks.
You love the socks.
I love the socks.
I got this as a gift.
So if they disappear from your house, you know where they went. Right?
Now we know who took them. Yeah. Well, I mean, African brands have slipped. Since you started this survey, you've seen a change. Just tell us at a high level, how bad is the decline?
Well, if you look at on average, when we actually started this the first time in 2030, but then we were just working with 8 countries. And at that time, it was about 30% of African brands. But I think it was a limited study. But we then since have expanded the study, and it's now up to 32 countries, which, as you said in your introduction, account for 85% of the population. So we're much closer to telling a good picture of the continent. And if you look at the last 10 years, excluding the first year or so, only 20% of the brands that Africans admire are African. So we fluctuated from 13, 17, 16, and now we're down to only 14% of the brands that Africans admire are African. It's a challenge, it's a problem. It's a bigger African problem, I think.
Yes. Now, the global brand still standing tall. When you speak Nike, as I said, being number one, I think about other sports type brands because, you know, we love our sports, especially our football. And you see the likes of Adidas and Puma and others. Do they feature?
Well, actually, in the top 5, you're going to get Adidas, Puma, and Nike. So, because I think, you know, soccer obviously being one of the biggest drivers in the continent, because sport in the continent, that's where you're going to see the sporting brands. The sporting brands are quite resilient. I think because most of us, we have that relationship with them, from school to sports, as passion. You know, for the things that we're excited about.
Yeah, MTN, I mean, still the pride of South Africa from a brand perspective, still tending tall, but below the top 10 now.
Well, it's a pride of the continent. I mean, serving more than 200 million people across the continent, helping them to connect, to communicate, and to transact. I think it's still an incredible performance. If you look at every single African brand, I think except for Trade Kings or so, has actually slipped. I mean, if you look
Trade
at
Kings from Zambia,
Trade Kings from Zambia. Yeah. If you look at and they've gone all the way up to I think 38 or so. If you look at if you look at even Dangote is now closer to 30%, and it used to be closer to MTN higher up. So all the African brands are really trending downwards, and I think it perhaps in tough times which we are going through, consumers tend to go to the brands they trust. And generally, because the international brands have got a longer history in the continent and in the world, those are the brands that get to be trusted.
What about devices? I mean, I've got a Samsung. Does it feature? Do they feature anywhere?
Well, Apple always features in the top 100 brands. No question about it. Yes. Apple features in the top 100. Techno features in the top 100. So the device brands are always in the top 100 because we've got such a personal relationship, with them.
Yeah. Now, you've introduced a new category, I mean, in the last 10 years. And I'm fascinated by why you did this, looking at brands that are doing good for people. Because during the COVID-19 pandemic, we all learned that we need one another. And young people in particular started asking, what what does your brand do for us in our community? What good are you doing? And you've introduced it. What did you find?
And not only did they ask, what are you doing good for the country or the continent, they've also said the second thing. They said, we will punish those brands which we believe are not doing good for the continent. Matter of fact, there are probably less brands tied to the brands than we are. They are willing to discard a brand. What we've discovered and why we introduced this is to really to speak to that idea of brands which are now moving from profits to purpose. And what we've discovered is the number one NGO brand that is doing good for society and environment is UNICEF. The number one non-African brand is Coca-Cola. The number one brand that's doing good for society and for the environment from Africa is MTN.
Well done
and
to
I
them.
think well done to go to MTN and many other brands. And I think it's good because we're beginning to see the effort and the energy that a lot of brands are putting in that space.
Media brands?
Media.
I have to come there.
I know you wanted me to say eNCA, but DSTV. And what's
DSTV.
And what's interesting about DSTV is that DSTV itself is not a channel, but it is a channel of channels, right?
Okay.
It enables brands like yours, eNCA, to be able to reach the rest of the continent. What's interesting about the media platform is that about 75% of the brands that Africans admire in the media space are non-African, and that's why if you look at the list, it's a BBC number 2, and BBC has been a stalwart through the World Service across the continent. A lot of the continent,
long before the days of television.
Long before the days of television, they entrenched themselves. CNN at number 3. So yes, we have a challenge in that space because I always say that if we are not telling our own story using our own channels, then the brands that are going to be carried are not necessarily going to be our brands.
People will see the foreign brands all the time. Now, we've just heard from Lesisha Kganyago, more bad news for you and me and many other consumers. The repo rate has gone up by 50 basis points. From a financial services perspective, we know there are South African banks that operate across the continent, for example, the likes of Absa, Standard Bank. In that category, who's standing out?
Well, Standard Bank, the oldest African bank, I think 160 years old, has catapulted all the way to number 1 in the continent, kicking GT Bank, which has been the stalwart brand in that space. And I mean, again, consistent with what we're saying, what consumers are looking for, they're looking for brands which are relevant, which are accessible, and which are making a difference in their life. And from the Standard Bank to the MTNs to the Cokes, the UNICEFs, that's what those brands are doing.
Okay, a general question as we conclude, Thebe. Thank you very much. What do you hope people will take out of this, and how can they access more details? I'm sure there's more data behind what we've just spoken about.
I think what we need to take out of this, we need to take the urgency out of this, because we need to realize that it is urgent for Africans to support and to create, consume the brands that they love and they admire. Fela Kuti said it so well in his old song. He says, we must buy Africa. He says, how can you buy Africa how can you love yourself if you cannot love that which you produce, which you create and consume that? And all of them, from the Fela to the Ngugiwa Thiong'o, to Chinua Achebe, they've always said the story that you must love where you come from, who you are, because we cannot compete with the Italians at being Italians and Americans at being Americans, but we can outdo them in Africa. With 1.3 billion people, we have the consumer base to be able to tell our own story, to consume our own brands, and to build this continent.
And your website, I guess that's where the details
So
will be.
the rest of the information, the biggest report will be out in the July issue of African Business, and that's where people will also find on www.brand.africa, which is where we normally put the top 100 brands. But over the next few weeks, I'll be going around the continent, as I always try to do, and to tell the story from country to country. And in South Africa, we'll be here in July to release the fuller list of the South African study.
We wish you well on your travels. That's Thebe Ikalafeng, founder and chairperson of Brand Africa. By the way, he's visited each and every country on our continent. What a feat.